Hello. My name is Faki, and I'm doing a report on Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was born on July 21, 1899, in Oak Park, Illinois. He is an American novelist and short story writer, awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954. He was noted both for the intense masculinity of his writing and for his adventurous and widely publicized life. His succinct and lucid prose style exerted a powerful influence on American and British fiction in the 20th century. During his early years, Hemingway spent much of the summer months on the shores of Walloon Lake in Michigan, at the family's summer home, Windermere. While vacationing in the woods, young Ernest was able to hunt and fish. In high school, he played many sports, and excelled academically. He showed a particular talent for writing. He wrote for both his high school's newspaper, Trapeze, and for the yearbook, Tabula. His first job after high school was as a cub reporter for the Kansas City Star, a position arranged for him by his uncle. His tenure at the newspaper was short, a scant 6 months, but it left an indelible impression on the young writer. The paper's style guide influenced him to adopt the short, declarative statements in his writing that later became a hallmark of his work. Following America's entry into World War I, Hemingway tried to enlist in the U.S. Army. Enthusiastic as he was, Hemingway failed the physical examination due to poor eyesight. Still wanting to participate in the war effort, Hemingway signed up with the Red Cross as an ambulance driver. Upon leaving the U.S., he first traveled to Paris, and then received orders to report to Milan. A short time later, he moved to the town of Schio where he worked driving ambulances. While delivering chocolates and cigarettes to soldiers on the front, he was seriously injured on July 8, 1918 by fragments from an Austrian mortar shell. Though badly wounded by the mortar, and hit by machine gun fire as well, he worked to secure the safety of his fellow soldiers, getting them out of harm's way. The Italian government later awarded him the Silver Medal of Military Valor for his heroic actions. He spent time recovering at a hospital in Milan, where he met Agnes von Kurowski, a nurse originally from Washington, D.C. She was 6 years older than him, but nevertheless he fell in love with her, and planned to take her home to Oak Park. Agnes never did return with him as planned. Her involvement with an Italian officer ended their relationship. His time spent recovering in the Milan hospital, and his failed romance with Agnes von Kurowski served as inspiration for Hemingway's famous novel, A Farewell to Arms. Upon returning to the U.S., he settled in Chicago, after a brief stay back in Oak Park. In September 1921, he married Hadley Richardson. Later that year he took a job with the Toronto Daily Star as their European correspondent. Hemingway and his bride soon relocated to Paris, to an inexpensive apartment, with a rented room nearby where Hemingway could work in peace. While still in Chicago, he came to know Sherwood Anderson, the American author. Anderson provided him with a letter of introduction to Gertrude Stein, who in turn introduced him to the Parisian modern movement of literature. Hemingway was also acquainted with Ezra Pound, James Joyce, Max Eastman, and other members of the Lost Generation. Hemingway chronicled his time in Paris in his posthumously published memoirs A Movable Feast. In addition to his own literary work, his first book 3 Stories and 10 Poems was published in Paris in 1923. Hemingway wrote extensively for the Toronto Star and enjoyed much success as a foreign correspondent. He covered major world events, such as the Geneva Conference in 1922, and the Greco-Turkish War. Hemingway continued writing for the Toronto Star through 1924. Many of his writings from this period can be found in the collection Dateline, Toronto. The remaining years spent in Paris were a very productive time in his early career, allowing him to experiment with and develop his unique literary style that would become his hallmark. In 1926 his famous novel The Sun Also Rises was published. By 1927 his first marriage was over. He married Pauline Pfeiffer, of Piggott, Arkansas the same year. Pauline was a fashion reporter that Hemingway had met in Paris, though they would leave the city in 1928 seeking a fresh start. The early 1930s proved to be a productive time for Hemingway. Fascinated by bullfighting, he traveled to Spain to do research for the non-fiction book, Death in the Afternoon. It was published in 1932 to generally poor reviews and was followed by several less than successful short story collections. Ever the adventurer, Hemingway traveled to Africa on a shooting safari in November 1933. Although the trip was somewhat disastrous, Hemingway clashed with his companions and later became ill with dysentery. It provided him with ample material for a short story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, as well as a non-fiction book, Green Hills of Africa. While Hemingway was on a hunting and fishing trip in the United States in the summer of 1936, the Spanish Civil War began. A supporter of the anti-fascist forces, Hemingway donated money for ambulances. He also signed on as a journalist to cover the conflict for a group of American newspapers and became involved in making a documentary. While in Spain, Hemingway began an affair with Martha Gellhorn, an American journalist and documentarian. Weary of her husband's adulterous ways, Pauline took her sons and left Key West in December 1939. Only months after she divorced Hemingway, he married Martha Gellhorn in November 1940. Hemingway and Gellhorn rented a farmhouse in Cuba just outside of Havana, where both could work on their writing. Traveling between Cuba and Key West, Hemingway wrote one of his most popular novels, For Whom the Bell Tolls. A fictionalized account of the Spanish Civil War, the book was published in October 1940 and became a bestseller. Despite being named the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in 1941, the book did not win because the president of Columbia University, which bestowed the award, vetoed the decision. As Martha's reputation as a journalist grew, she earned assignments around the globe, leaving Hemingway resentful of her long absences. But soon, they would both be globetrotting. After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, both Hemingway and Gellhorn signed on as war correspondents. Hemingway was allowed on board a troop transport ship, from which he was able to watch the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944. While in London during the war, Hemingway began an affair with the woman who would become his fourth wife, journalist Mary Welsh. Gellhorn learned of the affair and divorced Hemingway in 1945. He and Welsh married in 1946. They alternated between homes in Cuba and Idaho. In January 1951, Hemingway began writing a book that would become one of his most celebrated works, The Old Man and the Sea. A bestseller, the novella also won Hemingway his long-awaited Pulitzer Prize in 1953. The Hemingways traveled extensively but were often the victims of bad luck. They were involved in 2 plane crashes in Africa during one trip in 1953. Hemingway was severely injured, sustaining internal and head injuries as well as burns. Some newspapers erroneously reported that he had died in the second crash. In 1954, Hemingway was awarded the career-topping Nobel Prize for Literature. In January 1959, the Hemingways moved from Cuba to Ketchum, Idaho. Hemingway, now nearly 60 years old, had suffered for several years with high blood pressure and the effects of years of heavy drinking. He had also become moody and depressed and appeared to be deteriorating mentally. In November 1960, Hemingway was admitted to the Mayo Clinic for treatment of his physical and mental symptoms. He received electroshock therapy for his depression and was sent home after a 2-month stay. Hemingway became further depressed when he realized he was unable to write after the treatments. After 3 suicide attempts, Hemingway was readmitted to the Mayo Clinic and given more shock treatments. Although his wife protested, he convinced his doctors he was well enough to go home. Only days after being discharged from the hospital, Hemingway shot himself in the head in his Ketchum home early on the morning of July 2, 1961. He died instantly.